The scout ship Vral Tassu moved slowly through the dark, its sensors sweeping the empty space near Mars. Captain Farron Adassi sat in the command chair, watching the red planet grow larger on the main screen. His crew was quiet. They had been traveling for 6 months, mapping this system for the first time, and nothing about it had surprised them yet. Then the sensor officer, a young Caliph named Doru, made a small sound of confusion. "Captain, I am reading something large near the third moon of the red planet. It is not a moon. It is not natural." Farron leaned forward. "Show me." The screen changed. A shape appeared, long and dark, drifting without lights, without any sign of engines burning. It was enormous, far larger than the Vral Tessu, larger than anything the Caliph had built in the last 100 years. Its hull was scarred, covered in old damage, but it held its shape. It looked like a blade, thin at the front and wide at the back, built for war. "Life signs?" Farron asked. Doru shook his head slowly. "None that I can find. No power output from the engines. No communication signals." "It is dead, Captain." "It has been dead for a very long time." "Then why does it still hold formation with the moon? Why has it not drifted away?" Nobody had an answer. The ship should have moved, pulled by gravity, pushed by the solar wind, drifting slowly out of any fixed position over the years. Instead it sat there, patient, as if it were waiting. Farron gave the order to move closer. The crew worked in silence, running scan after scan, trying to understand what they were looking at. The ship had no name written on its hull that they could read. Its markings were faded, but as they drew nearer, one symbol became clear. A circle with a single line through it, and beneath it, letters in a language none of them knew. "This is not Caliph design," said the engineer, a thick-set officer named Bressa. "This is not any design in the records. Look at the hull thickness. Look at the size of those weapon ports. This was built to fight something big." "Or someone big," Doru said quietly. Farron ordered a small boarding team to prepare. He would not report this discovery until he understood what it was. His superiors back home would want answers, not questions, and right now, all he had were questions. The boarding team consisted of 4 Caliph, Farron himself, Bressa the engineer, Doru the sensor officer, and a young soldier named Tessic, who carried a weapon out of habit, rather than expectation of danger. They took a small shuttle across the gap between the 2 ships, and as they grew closer, the size of the warship became clear. It was not just large, it was a giant, built with a purpose so heavy that even now, dead and silent, it made the shuttle crew feel small. They found an opening near the middle of the hull, a wound from some old battle that had never been repaired. The metal edges were rough, but wide enough to fly the shuttle through into an internal bay. Emergency lights flickered on as they entered, weak and yellow, powered by some backup system that had somehow survived the years. "There is still power," Bressa said, surprised. "Old power, but real power. Something in this ship still works." They stepped out of the shuttle, into a wide, empty hangar. Dust floated in the low gravity. Old machines sat quiet in their berths, covered in a thin layer of frost. The air was thin but breathable, filtered by some system that had not stopped working, even after all this time. "How long has this ship been drifting?" Tessic asked, his voice echoing strangely in the big empty space. "I don't know," Farron said. "But it feels old, very old." They moved deeper into the ship, following corridors lit by the same weak yellow light. The walls were covered in more of the strange writing, some of it burned or torn away by damage, some of it strangely fresh, as if it had been added recently. Signs pointed toward different sections: crew quarters, engineering, medical bay, and further in, something marked with the same circle and line symbol from the hull. "That must be important," Doru said, looking at the symbol. "It repeats everywhere. Command deck, maybe." They followed the signs, moving carefully, weapons ready, though nothing moved to threaten them. The ship was a graveyard, but it did not feel empty. It felt like something was still present, still watching, even if nothing living moved through its halls. At last they reached a large door, sealed shut, with the same symbol carved deep into its metal surface. Bressa found a panel beside it, covered in dust, and after some careful work, managed to get a weak current flowing into it. The door groaned, then slid open with a tired hiss of old air escaping. Inside was a command room, unlike anything they had ever seen. Rows of dead screens lined the walls, some cracked, some simply dark. In the center of the room, raised on a platform, sat a single chair, larger than anything a normal person might need, built more like a throne than a station. And in that chair sat someone. The Caliph froze. For a moment, they were certain they were looking at a corpse, perfectly preserved by the cold of space and whatever systems kept the room sealed. But then the figure moved. Slowly, as if waking from a long sleep, a head lifted, and eyes opened. They were human eyes, though the Caliph did not know what a human was. The figure in the chair was clearly alive, though weathered by time in a way that seemed impossible. Her skin was pale, her hair long and silver gray, tied back simply. She wore a uniform, old and faded, but still recognizable as a uniform of rank. Around her neck hung a small metal token, worn smooth by years of touching. She looked at the four strangers standing in her doorway, and instead of fear, her face showed something closer to relief. "You are not what I expected," she said, her voice rough from disuse but steady. "But you will do. Finally, someone has come." Farron found his voice after a long moment. "Who? What are you? How are you alive?" The woman smiled, a tired, knowing smile. "My name is Captain Elena Voss. This ship is called the Kestrel's Vigil, and I have been waiting a very long time for someone to find me." "Waiting for what?" Tessic asked, his weapon still raised, though uncertain now whether it was needed. "For the ones who would come looking," Elena said. "I did not know what shape you would take. I did not know if you would have 2 legs or 4, whether you would breathe air or something else. But I knew someone would come, eventually, because ships like this one do not simply disappear from history. Someone always comes looking, sooner or later." Farron lowered his own weapon slightly, though he kept his guard up. "This ship, is it a weapon?" "It was built as one," Elena answered. "A long time ago, my people built ships like this, because we believed we were about to be destroyed. We believed something was coming for us, something vast and old, and we needed to be ready. This ship, and others like it, were part of that plan." "Something was coming for you?" Doru repeated. "What?" Elena's eyes moved past them, as if looking through the walls of the ship, out into the black of space. "I do not know if I should tell you yet. I do not know you. I do not know your people, your history, whether you are the kind who fight first and ask questions later, or the kind who listen. But I will tell you this ship has been sitting here for a reason. I chose this position, near this planet, because I believed that whatever direction the enemy came from, this would be a place where someone, eventually, would find me and hear my warning." "Warning about what?" Farron pressed. Elena studied him for a long moment, as if weighing something in her mind. Finally she said, "About the ones who destroyed my home, about the war that emptied most of human space, and about why this ship, alone of all our fleet, chose to wait instead of fight." The Caliph exchanged glances. This was far larger than anything they had expected to find near a quiet red planet at the edge of their surveyed space. "How long have you been sitting here?" Bressa asked. Elena considered the question. "By my ship's internal counter, it has been 312 years since I last spoke to another living person. I do not know how that compares to your own measure of time, but it has felt like every one of those years." The number hung in the air, impossible and heavy. 300 years alone, in the dark, waiting. "How is that possible?" Doru asked. "No living thing can survive that long." "I am not simply alive in the way you mean," Elena said. "My ship kept me in a special sleep, deep enough to slow my body almost to a stop, but not so deep that my mind could not be woken when needed. Sensors watched the space around us for centuries. Each time a ship or a signal came close, I woke, checked, and if it was not what I was waiting for, I returned to sleep. This is perhaps the 20th time I have woken. You are the first to actually find your way inside." Farron felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air of the ship. "What made you decide we were what you were waiting for?" "You came in a working ship, with weapons, but you did not fire on mine," Elena said. "You searched instead of attacking. That told me you were curious, not simply hungry for destruction. It was enough to take a chance." She rose slowly from her chair, her joints stiff from centuries of near stillness, and stood taller than any of the 4 Caliph. though not unusually tall for a human. She looked at each of them in turn. "I will not lie to you and pretend this is a simple discovery," she said. "You have found a warship built during the darkest years of my people's history. You have found me, the last officer of that war still breathing. And somewhere out in this galaxy, I believe, are the ones we built this ship to fight. If they are still out there, then finding me means the danger is not over. It only means the waiting has changed." The words settled over the small boarding party like a weight. Farron thought of his home, of the quiet systems his people had settled over the last century, systems that had never known real war. He thought of the peaceful trade routes, the slow growth of Kalith civilization, none of it prepared for whatever this human woman was describing. "You should come with us," Farron said finally. "Back to our ship. We can take you somewhere safe, somewhere you can rest, somewhere your people, if they still exist, could perhaps be contacted." Elena's expression softened, just slightly. "Thank you. But first, you should understand what you are dealing with. This ship is not simply my prison. It is also a message, and a key. There is more here than an old woman and old memories. There is a warning that needs to reach the right ears, and a weapon that must not fall into the wrong hands." "What kind of weapon?" Tessic asked, his voice tight. Elena looked toward the far wall of the command room, where a sealed section sat behind thick doors marked with warning symbols even the Kalith could understand without translation. "The kind that ended a war," she said quietly, "and the kind that, if used wrongly, could end far more than that." The four Kalith stood in silence, the weight of discovery settling over them. They had come looking for an empty wreck, a puzzle to solve and report home. Instead, they had found a living piece of history, a warning wrapped inside 300 years of patient waiting, and the beginning of a story none of them yet understood. Farron looked at Elena, at the tired strength in her eyes, and made a decision that would change the future of both their peoples. "Then you had better start explaining," he said, "because whatever waits out there, I would rather understand it before it finds us unprepared." Elena nodded slowly, and for the first time in 300 years, she allowed herself something like hope. "Yes," she said, "it is time someone finally listened." Behind her, deep within the ship, a system that had slept for centuries, began, quietly, to stir. Captain Elena Voss led the four Kalith through the corridors of the Kestrel's vigil, her steps slow but steady, as if her body was slowly remembering how to walk after centuries of stillness. Farron walked beside her, watching her carefully, unsure if she might collapse at any moment. But she did not falter. "You want to know what we were fighting," Elena said as they walked. "It is not a short story. It began before I was born, on a planet you would call Earth, though by the time this ship was built, Earth had already changed beyond what its founders would recognize." She stopped at a large viewing window that looked out into the endless black of space. The stars beyond seemed to watch silently as she spoke. "Humanity spread out from our homeworld slowly, over many generations. We built colonies on moons, on distant planets, on stations built from hollowed asteroids. We fought among ourselves sometimes, as most young species do, but we were, for the most part, a curious and hopeful people. We believed the galaxy was ours to explore, ours to understand." "What changed?" Doru asked. "We found something we should not have found," Elena said. "An old signal, buried in the noise of deep space, coming from a system far beyond our borders. My people were proud, and perhaps too eager. We sent ships to investigate instead of caution. What we found there was not a friendly greeting. It was a graveyard, the remains of a civilization far older than ours, destroyed so completely that only fragments of their cities remained, buried under layers of dust and radiation." "Who did that?" Bressa asked. "We did not know at first," Elena said. "We only knew that whatever destroyed them was still out there, somewhere, and that our scouting ships had likely been seen. We debated for years whether to retreat quietly and hope we had gone unnoticed, or to prepare for the worst. In the end, preparation won, too late as it turned out. She led them onward, deeper into the ship, until they reached what looked like a long memorial hall. Rows of small plaques lined the walls, each one engraved with names, more names than the Kalith could easily count. "These are the crews of every human ship lost in what we came to call the Withering War," Elena said. "It was not one great battle. It was hundreds of smaller ones, spread across years, as an enemy we barely understood attacked our colonies one by one. They called themselves nothing we ever learned. We only ever called them the Hollow, because everywhere they passed, they left worlds empty. Empty how? Tessic asked. Not destroyed in the way you might imagine, Elena said. No craters, no burning cities. They took the people, all of them. Every colony they touched went silent within days, and when we investigated, we found nothing. No bodies, no wreckage of a battle, only empty streets and empty homes, as if the population had simply vanished into the air. The Caliph fell silent, imagining such a fate. For years we did not understand how or why, Elena continued. We built defenses, we built fleets, we tried to fight back. But the Hollow moved faster than we could respond, striking at colonies we had barely finished building shields for. We lost dozens of worlds this way, before we finally captured something, a piece of Hollow technology left behind after a battle, and began to understand what we were truly facing. What were they? Farron asked quietly. Not a single species, as far as we could tell, Elena said. More like a process, a method of conquest passed down through countless victims, refined and perfected over ages longer than our recorded history. They did not fight to kill, they fought to absorb, to take a population's knowledge, its will, its very identity, and fold it into their own collective purpose. What was left behind, empty and silent, was simply what remained after that purpose had been served. The weight of her words pressed down on the small group. Doru shivered, despite the mild temperature of the corridor. How did you fight something like that? Bressa asked. Slowly, and at terrible cost, Elena said. We built ships like this one, designed not simply to destroy Hollow forces, but to resist whatever method they used to take a population. This ship, and its sisters, were meant to be the last line, the ones who would stand between the Hollow and the core of human civilization, if all else failed. They reached the end of the memorial hall, where a single larger plaque stood apart from the rest, carved with more care than any other. This is dedicated to the crew of the first ship lost in the war, Elena said softly. My mother served on that ship. I was 12 years old when it went silent. I did not learn what silent meant, in that context, until many years later, when I stood exactly where you are standing now, staring at her name carved into cold metal. Farron studied the plaque, though the words meant nothing to him in his own language. I am sorry, he said, and meant it. Thank you, Elena said. It was a long time ago, by any measure but my own memory. They continued walking, and eventually reached a smaller room, clearly once used as an officer's quarters, though sparse and functional. Elena sat on the edge of a simple bed, resting for the first time since waking. How did the war end? Farron asked, sitting across from her on an old chair bolted to the floor. With sacrifice, Elena said. After years of losses, our scientists finally developed something that could stop the Hollow's method of conquest, at least on a small scale. A weapon that did not destroy their ships outright, but broke whatever bond allowed them to absorb a population. Used correctly, it could free anyone the Hollow had taken, restoring their minds, their will, their identity. That sounds like a victory, Tessic said. It should have been, Elena said, her voice heavy, but the weapon required a terrible price. It could only be triggered from very close range, inside the heart of a Hollow fleet, and it required a living mind to guide it, a mind willing to open itself fully to the connection between the weapon and its targets. Anyone who used it risked their own identity being lost in the process, just as the Hollow's victims had lost theirs. You used it, Farron said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn. I did, Elena said. Not once, but several times, in the final years of the war. Each time, it grew harder to return fully to myself afterward. Each time, I lost a little more of who I had been before. By the final battle, the one that finally broke the main Hollow fleet threatening our core worlds, I was barely holding on to my own mind. My crew brought me back, barely, and my superiors made a decision. She reached up and touched the small metal token around her neck. They placed me here, in this ship, and put me into a long sleep, hoping that with enough time, and enough distance from the horrors I had witnessed, my mind might heal on its own. They positioned this ship near a quiet, undeveloped system, one unlikely to be found quickly, believing that if the Hollow ever returned, This ship, with its weapon and its still recovering captain, might be needed one final time. Did the Hollow return? Doru asked. I do not know, Elena admitted. That is the terrible truth of my long wait. I have slept through 300 years of silence, waking only when something approached, hoping each time it would be either my own people coming to bring me home, or a sign that the Hollow had finally been dealt with for good. Instead, I found only quiet space, until you arrived. Farron sat with this information for a long moment. You do not know if the threat you fought is even still out there. No, Elena said. I do not know if humanity itself is still out there, not in any form I would recognize. 300 years is a very long time for a civilization to change, to grow, or to fall. I could return to a galaxy where my people thrive beyond anything I imagined, or one where they no longer exist at all. The silence in the small room was heavy with unspoken possibilities. Then let us find out together, Farron said finally. We have ships capable of travel, records of every civilized system we have encountered in our surveys. If your people still exist, we can help you find them. Elena looked at him with something like gratitude, though her eyes remained cautious. You would do this, knowing what you now know, knowing that I carry inside me both a warning and a weapon capable of terrible things? We would do this, because you have been alone for 300 years, waiting for someone to simply listen, Farron said. That alone deserves an answer, whatever else follows. Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying the four strangers who had found her, considering all the ways this could go wrong, and all the ways it might, finally, go right. Very well, she said at last. Take me to your ship, but first, I must retrieve something from the sealed section of this vessel, the section marked with warnings even you understood, without translation. If we are to move forward, you should understand exactly what still sleeps within these walls, and exactly what it might mean if the Hollow have indeed returned. She rose from the bed, steadier now, her old strength beginning to return with purpose restored. The four Caliph followed her deeper into the ship, toward the sealed section, unaware that far beyond the edge of their surveyed space, something vast and patient had already noticed the sudden flicker of long-dormant systems waking after 3 centuries of silence. The waiting, for more than one party in this story, was coming to an end. The sealed section of the Kestrel's vigil sat behind 3 separate doors, each one thicker than the last, each one marked with warnings in a language older than the rest of the ship's writing. Elena Voss stood before the final door, her hand resting on a panel that had not been touched in 300 years. Once I open this, she said, there is no simple way to close it again, not without another long process of sealing and codes I am not certain I remember correctly. I want you to understand that before I proceed. Farron looked at his small team. Bressa nodded grimly. Doru looked nervous but resolved, and Tessic gripped his weapon a little tighter, though everyone in the room understood that no simple weapon would matter much if what lay behind that door decided to be a threat. We understand, Farron said. Proceed. Elena pressed her hand fully against the panel. For a moment nothing happened, and Farron wondered if 3 centuries had finally broken whatever mechanism controlled the door. Then, slowly, ancient locks disengaged one by one, and the door slid open with a deep groan of metal that had not moved in longer than any of the Caliph present had been alive. Inside was not a weapon room in the way any of them expected. There were no cannons, no obvious devices of destruction. Instead, the room held a single large chamber, filled with soft light from crystals embedded in the walls, crystals that pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat. In the center of the chamber stood a tall, silver structure, shaped roughly like a human figure but taller, more slender, its surface smooth and unmarked by the wear that covered the rest of the ship. This is the Aegis Core, Elena said quietly, stepping into the chamber with something like reverence. This is the device that ended the war, or rather, this is the vessel that allowed the device to be used. It looks almost alive, Doru said, staring at the gently pulsing crystals. In a way, it is, Elena said. It requires a living mind to activate, as I told you before. My mind, specifically, since it was tuned to my particular pattern during the final years of the war. No one else could use it as effectively, not without months of preparation that we never had time for. She reached out and touched the surface of the silver figure. The crystals pulsed brighter for a moment, responding to her touch, before settling back into their slow, patient rhythm. "It recognizes you," Bressa said, surprised. "It never forgot me," Elena said, a strange mixture of comfort and sorrow in her voice. "Even through 300 years of sleep, this device and I remained connected in some way I do not fully understand. Perhaps that is why I woke each time something approached. Perhaps the core sensed danger before my own mind fully did." As she spoke, a soft chime sounded from a small console beside the chamber entrance, one Farron had not noticed before. Elena turned toward it sharply, her body suddenly tense in a way it had not been throughout their entire conversation. "That is an alert," she said. "A very old alert, one I have not heard in 300 years. "What does it mean?" Farron asked, already reaching for his own weapon out of instinct. Elena moved to the console, her fingers moving across controls that seemed to come back to her more naturally than her walking had earlier. Symbols and numbers scrolled across a small screen, difficult for the Caliph to interpret, but clearly meaningful to her. "This ship maintained passive sensors across a wide area during my sleep," she said. "Sensors designed specifically to detect a particular signature, the same signature the Hollow used whenever their fleets moved through a system." "And?" Doru asked, though he already feared the answer. "And something matching that signature has just entered the outer edge of this system," Elena said, her voice grim. "Not close yet. Perhaps several days away, even at speed, but it is here, and it is moving in this direction." The chamber fell silent, except for the gentle pulse of the crystals. "How certain are you?" Farron asked. "Very certain," Elena said. "This sensor system was built specifically for this purpose, refined over years of war to be accurate. If it says hollow, then hollow it is. Could it be a different threat that simply matches the pattern by coincidence?" Bressa asked, grasping for any alternative explanation. "Unlikely, but not impossible," Elena admitted. "Whatever the case, we cannot ignore this. If it is truly the hollow, then everything I feared while sleeping in that chair has come to pass. They still exist, and now they have found their way into a system inhabited by a species that has never faced them before." Farron felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. His people, the Caliph, had never known a war like the one Elena described. Their conflicts had always been small, contained, fought with rules and limits neither side wished to break. The idea of an enemy that erased entire populations without a trace was almost impossible to imagine as real. "What do we do?" Tessic asked, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by genuine fear. "First, we do not panic," Elena said, though her own hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Second, we must warn your people, and mine if any remain to be warned. Third, we must decide whether this ship, and this core, are still capable of doing what they were built to do." "Are they?" Farron asked. Elena looked at the silver figure standing patiently in the center of the chamber, its crystals pulsing steadily, waiting, just as she had waited for 300 years. "I do not know," she admitted. "The core has not been used in 3 centuries. I do not know if it retains the same power it once had, or if my own mind, worn by centuries of sleep and old wounds, could survive using it again even once, let alone enough times to matter." "Then we need time to find out," Bressa said. "Time we may not have, if this threat is truly approaching." "We have some time," Elena said. "Days, at least, before it arrives close enough to matter. That is not much, but it is not nothing either." Farron made a decision quickly, the way officers are sometimes forced to, when circumstances refuse to wait for perfect certainty. "We return to our ship immediately. We send word to Caliph Command. Tell them everything you have told us. If this threat is real, our people need to know, and need to prepare, whatever preparation might mean against something like this." "They will not believe you easily," Elena warned. "A story of an ancient war, an alien species that erases populations, a captain who has slept 300 years. This will sound like fiction to anyone who has not stood in this room and felt what we have felt. Then you will need to come with us and tell them yourself," Farron said. "Your presence alone will be evidence enough that something extraordinary has happened here." Elena considered this, then nodded slowly. "Very well. But we take the core with us as well. If the Hollow are truly returning, we may need it again, and I would rather have it ready and available than left behind on a drifting ship that anyone might stumble upon." The transfer of the Aegis Core proved more difficult than any of them expected. The device, despite its slender appearance, was heavier than it looked, and required careful handling to avoid damaging whatever delicate systems kept it functional after 3 centuries of dormancy. Bressa worked for hours with tools borrowed from the shuttle, carefully disconnecting old power systems and preparing the core for transport, while Elena watched over every step with the protective care of someone guarding something irreplaceable. As they worked, Doru continued monitoring the sensors, watching the distant signature Elena had identified grow slowly closer with each passing hour. It was not moving quickly, which offered some small comfort, but it was moving steadily, with the kind of patient certainty that suggested whatever controlled it was not concerned about being detected. "It knows we are here," Elena said at one point, watching the same readings over Doru's shoulder. "Or if it does not know precisely, it suspects. The hollow have always been drawn toward concentrations of activity, of energy, of life. Waking this ship's systems after 300 years of silence would create exactly the kind of signature they are trained to notice." "Did we cause this?" Farron asked, a horrible thought occurring to him. "By finding you, by waking your ship, did we draw this threat toward us?" Elena was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps," she said finally. "Or perhaps it was already coming, and we simply happened to wake at the same moment it arrived. I cannot know for certain, but I will tell you this. Whether we caused this moment or not, we are the ones now standing at the center of it, and running from that truth will not make it less real." Her words settled heavily over the small group, but there was also something steadying in them, something that reminded Farron why this woman had survived 3 centuries of impossible waiting. She did not flinch from difficult truths. She simply accepted them and moved forward. By the time the core was finally ready for transport, the sensor readings had grown more precise. Whatever approached was not a single ship, but something larger, a formation moving in the careful, patient pattern Elena described as typical of hollow fleets preparing for a slow, thorough conquest rather than a quick strike. "We have perhaps 2 days before they reach a distance where detection becomes mutual," Elena said, studying the final readings before they left the sealed chamber. 2 days to warn your people, to prepare whatever defenses can be prepared, and to determine whether this old weapon and its worn-out captain still have anything left to give." Farron looked at her, at the quiet determination in her eyes despite everything she had already sacrificed, and felt something shift in his own understanding of what they were truly facing. "Then we should not waste any more time here," he said. "Let us return to the Vral Tesu and begin preparing for whatever comes next." They left the sealed chamber together, the Aegis core carefully secured for transport, the countdown to an uncertain future already ticking steadily forward, whether any of them were ready for it or not. The Vral Tesu raced back toward Kalith space at maximum safe speed, carrying not only its original crew but also Elena Voss, 300 years removed from her own time, and the carefully secured Aegis core, resting in the ship's small cargo bay under constant guard. Farron spent most of the journey in the communications room, trying to explain the situation to Kalith High Command, exactly as Elena had warned him it would go. The senior officers on the other end of the transmission listened politely, asked careful questions, and made no attempt to hide their skepticism. "You are telling us," said Commander Yasil, the officer overseeing this sector, "that you found a 300-year-old human warship with a living captain still aboard, and that this captain has warned you of an approaching alien fleet capable of erasing entire populations without a trace." "That is correct, Commander," Farron said. "And you have brought this captain, along with some kind of weapon, back toward Kalith territory, based entirely on her word." "Not entirely her word," Farron said. "The sensor readings from her ship detected the approaching signature independently. Our own sensors have now picked up the same readings, growing closer by the hour." There was a long pause on the other end of the transmission. Finally, Commander Yasil spoke again, his tone slightly less dismissive. "Send us the sensor data directly. If what you say is true, we will need to see it with our own instruments before committing any resources to a threat this extraordinary." Farron transmitted everything Doru had gathered, and waited anxiously through the following hours as Kalith Command analyzed the data on their end. When Commander Yasil finally responded again, his voice carried a new weight of seriousness. "Our own long-range sensors confirm an unusual formation, approaching from the direction you indicated," he said. We cannot yet determine its nature or intent, but the pattern of movement is unlike anything in our records. Bring your human captain and this weapon of hers directly to Fleet Command. We will need to hear everything she has to say, and we will need to see this Aegis core for ourselves. Elena, who had been listening quietly from the back of the room, finally spoke. Commander, may I address you directly? There was a brief pause before Yasil responded. Go ahead. I understand your skepticism, Elena said. In your position, I would share it. But I ask you to prepare your defenses, regardless of whether you fully believe my story. The threat approaching does not require your belief to be real, only your unpreparedness to be devastating. Another pause, longer this time. We will take appropriate precautions, Yasil said finally. Continue toward Fleet Command. We will meet you there. The remainder of the journey passed in tense preparation. Bressa worked constantly on the Aegis core, trying to determine its current condition, without the specialized equipment that would have been available during the war it was built for. Doru tracked the approaching signature obsessively, watching its slow, steady advance with growing anxiety. Tessic trained relentlessly with the ship's limited weapon systems, as if physical readiness alone might somehow prepare him for an enemy none of them fully understood. Elena spent much of her time simply resting, her body still recovering from centuries of controlled sleep, though her mind remained sharp and focused. She spoke with Farron often during this period, filling in details of her past, of the war, of the weight she still carried from every use of the Aegis core during those final desperate years. Tell me honestly, Farron said, during one such conversation. Do you believe you can use the core again, if it comes to that? Elena was quiet for a long moment before answering. I do not know, she admitted. Each time I used it during the war, it took something from me, some small piece of who I was before. By the final battle, I was barely myself anymore, held together more by duty than by any clear sense of identity. 300 years of sleep may have healed some of that damage, or it may have simply preserved me in that broken state, waiting to be shattered further the moment I try again. And if using it costs you everything? Farron asked quietly. Then it will not be the first time I have made that trade, Elena said. I made it willingly during the war, knowing full well what it might cost. If the Hollow have truly returned, and if they threaten your people now as they once threatened mine, I would make that same trade again, without hesitation. Farron studied her for a long moment, seeing not just a soldier from an ancient war, but someone who had already given more of herself than anyone should ever be asked to give. I hope it does not come to that, he said finally. So do I, Elena said. But hope alone has never stopped the Hollow before, and I doubt it will start now. They arrived at Fleet Command 2 days later, exactly as the approaching signature grew close enough for even Calith long-range sensors to confirm independently what Elena had warned them of. The formation was massive, dozens of ships moving in a pattern that suggested coordinated, patient conquest rather than a simple military strike. Fleet Command itself was a bustling station, orbiting one of the core Calith worlds, home to the largest concentration of Calith military resources in the sector. When the Vral Tessu docked, Elena and the small boarding party were escorted immediately to a large briefing room, where senior officers, including Commander Yasil himself, waited, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. Elena stood before them, still weakened from her long sleep, still carrying the weight of centuries, and told her story once more, from the beginning. She spoke of the Withering War, of the Hollow's terrible method of conquest, of the Aegis core, and the price required to use it. She held nothing back, understanding that half-truths would serve no one well in a moment like this. When she finished, the room remained silent for a long time. Finally, an older officer near the back spoke up. Even if everything you say is true, he said, not unkindly, how can we trust that this weapon of yours will work against a threat we have never faced, using technology from a species we know almost nothing about? You cannot fully trust it, Elena admitted. I cannot even fully promise it will work as it once did, but I can tell you this. Without it, based on everything I know of the Hollow, your people will have no effective defense against what is approaching. With it, however uncertain, you at least have a chance. The room fell into tense discussion, officers debating strategy, resources, and the wisdom of trusting an ancient weapon, wielded by a captain whose own mind might not survive its use. Farron watched Elena throughout this debate, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet patience of someone who had already spent 300 years waiting for people to simply listen. Eventually, Commander Yasil made the decision that mattered most. "We do not have the luxury of prolonged debate," he said, silencing the room. "Our own sensors confirm the threat's approach. Whatever doubts remain about the details of this human captain's story, the danger itself is not in doubt. We will prepare our fleet for battle, and we will position Captain Voss and her weapon at the heart of our formation, where it can be used if all else fails." The following day passed in frantic preparation. Calith ships gathered in defensive formation around the approaching threat's projected path, while engineers worked alongside Bressa to fully understand and stabilize the Aegis Corps' systems. Elena rested as much as she could, though sleep, ironically, felt harder to find now than it had during 3 centuries of controlled stillness. Farron found her in a quiet observation room the night before the Hollow Fleet was expected to arrive, staring out at the stars with an expression he had come to recognize as her particular kind of calm before difficult moments. "Are you ready?" he asked, sitting beside her. "No," Elena said honestly. "I do not think anyone is ever truly ready for something like this, but I am prepared to do what must be done, regardless of readiness." "What happens if it costs you everything, this time?" Farron asked quietly. Elena was silent for a long moment before answering. "Then perhaps it will finally be over," she said. "One way or another. 300 years of waiting for this moment. I would rather it end here, doing what I was made to do, than continue drifting endlessly through empty space, waiting for a purpose that never comes." Farron did not know how to respond to that, so he simply sat with her in silence, watching the stars, until the quiet gave way to the first alerts of the approaching enemy fleet finally entering range. The battle, when it came, would test everything Elena Voss had left to give, and everything the Calith had learned to believe in during their brief, extraordinary encounter with a captain who had waited 300 years for exactly this moment. The Hollow Fleet emerged from the dark exactly as Elena Voss had described it 300 years before, in formations built for patient, thorough conquest rather than swift destruction. Dozens of ships moved together, dark and silent, their approach carrying the same terrible calm she remembered from her own war, the same certainty that resistance would ultimately fail against a method of conquest refined over ages longer than any species present could imagine. Aboard the Calith flagship, positioned at the heart of the defensive formation, Elena stood once more beside the Aegis Corps, now fully connected to the ship's systems, its crystals pulsing steadily in anticipation of what was to come. Farron stood nearby, along with Commander Yasil and a small group of senior officers, all watching the same terrible sight on the main viewing screen. "They are not firing," Doru reported from his station, confusion evident in his voice. "No weapons discharge, no obvious attack pattern. They are simply approaching." "That is how it begins," Elena said quietly. "They do not need weapons in the way you understand them. Their method works differently. Watch your sensors closely. If a certain kind of field begins forming around their formation, that is when the true danger starts." Commander Yasil ordered the Calith fleet to hold position, weapons ready, but uncertain what target to strike against an enemy that offered no obvious point of attack. For several tense minutes, the two fleets simply faced each other in silence, the hollow ships drawing steadily closer. Then Doru's sensors flared with sudden alarm. "Field detected. Building around their formation, expanding outward, exactly as you described, Captain Voss." "That is our moment," Elena said, moving to fully connect herself with the Aegis Corps. "Once that field reaches our fleet, it will begin its work, trying to unravel our minds, our will, everything that makes us who we are. The Corps can counter it, but only if activated before the field fully takes hold." "Do it," Commander Yasil said, his voice tight but resolved. Elena closed her eyes and placed both hands against the smooth surface of the silver figure. The crystals throughout the chamber flared brilliantly, and a low hum began building through the ship, felt more than heard, resonating in the very bones of everyone present. "I can feel it," Elena said, her voice strained. "The field, reaching toward us. It is the same as before, exactly the same." Farron watched her closely, seeing the effort etched across her face, the same terrible cost she had described to him just the night before. Her body remained still, but something in her expression suggested a battle far more intense than anything visible on the surface. The hum grew louder, and slowly, the approaching field visible on their sensors began to falter, then recede, pushed back by whatever counter-effect the Aegis core was generating. The hollow formation, sensing this unexpected resistance, shifted its approach, several ships breaking away to circle toward different angles, as if testing for a weakness in this sudden, unfamiliar defense. "It is working," Doru reported, disbelief evident in his voice. "Their field cannot penetrate whatever barrier the core is generating around our fleet." But the cost was becoming visible as well. Elena's body trembled slightly, sweat forming despite the room's controlled temperature, her breathing growing ragged, even as she remained focused entirely on maintaining the core's effect. "Captain Voss," Farron said urgently, "how much longer can you sustain this?" "As long as necessary," Elena said through gritted teeth. "This is what I was made for. This is what 300 years of waiting was always leading toward." The battle continued in this strange, mostly silent fashion for nearly an hour, the hollow fleet probing for weaknesses, while Elena and the Aegis Corps held their strange, terrible field at bay. Kalith ships, no longer threatened by the Hollow's primary method of conquest, began engaging more traditional weapons against the enemy formation, discovering that without their unraveling field to soften resistance beforehand, Hollow ships proved far more vulnerable to direct attack than anyone had expected. "Their hulls are weaker than ours," Bressa reported excitedly from her station, monitoring the battle's progress. "Whatever they invest in that field technology, it seems to come at the cost of physical armor. Direct hits are proving far more effective than we predicted." Slowly, methodically, the tide of battle began shifting. Hollow ships, unable to soften Kalith resistance through their usual method, found themselves increasingly vulnerable to conventional weapons fire. One by one, their formation began to fracture, ships breaking away, some destroyed outright, others simply retreating into the dark from which they had come. But the strain on Elena continued to build, her trembling grew more pronounced, and Farron, watching helplessly beside her, saw something in her eyes that reminded him of her earlier description, of pieces of herself slowly being worn away by the terrible cost of the core's power. "Captain Voss, the enemy formation is breaking apart," Farron said. "You can release the core now. The battle is turning in our favor." "Not yet," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper now. "Not until I am certain they are fully repelled. Not until your people are safe." She held on for several more minutes, watching through senses that seemed to extend beyond normal perception, connected in some deep way to the core's power, until finally, the last hollow ships turned and retreated fully from the system, their strange, patient formation broken and scattered. Only then did Elena release her grip on the silver figure, collapsing immediately into Farron's waiting arms, her body suddenly limp with exhaustion beyond anything he had witnessed before. "Captain Voss," he said urgently, lowering her carefully to the floor. "Elena, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open slowly, focusing on his face with obvious effort. "I hear you," she said weakly. "I am still myself. Barely, but myself." Relief flooded through Farron, and around the room, officers who had watched the entire battle unfold began to understand the true magnitude of what this single woman had accomplished, at tremendous personal cost, to protect a species she had known for barely a week. Commander Yasil approached slowly, kneeling beside Elena, with an expression far different from the skepticism he had shown just days before. "Captain Voss," he said quietly, "on behalf of the Kalith people, I offer you our deepest gratitude. What you have done here today will not be forgotten." Elena managed a weak smile. "I did not do this only for gratitude, Commander," she said. "I did this because it is what I was made to do, what I promised myself I would do, if the moment ever came again. 300 years of waiting, finally given purpose." Over the following weeks, as Elena slowly recovered from the toll the battle had taken on her, both physically and mentally, Kalith scientists worked alongside Bressa to study the Aegis core more thoroughly, hoping to understand its function well enough to perhaps develop similar defenses without requiring such a devastating personal cost from any single individual. Elena herself became something of a legend among the Kalith, the human captain who had waited 3 centuries in the dark, only to save an entire species from a threat they had never known existed. She spoke often with Kalith leadership about humanity's history, about the Withering War, about the terrible cost of the Hollow's conquest, information the Caliph now used to prepare more broadly for the possibility that other Hollow forces might exist elsewhere in the galaxy. Farron remained close to her throughout this period, their friendship deepening into something neither of them had quite expected when they first boarded her drifting warship near Mars. He helped her navigate this new world she found herself in, 300 years removed from everything she had once known, while she, in turn, helped his people understand a threat far greater than anything their peaceful history had prepared them to face. Eventually, using information gathered from the defeated Hollow fleet's own systems, Caliph and human scholars together began piecing together clues about what remained of humanity in the wider galaxy. Whether entire worlds still thrived, whether scattered remnants survived in hidden corners of space, or whether humanity had faded entirely into memory, remained uncertain. But for the first time in 300 years, Elena Voss allowed herself to hope for answers, rather than simply enduring endless, patient waiting. On the day the Kestrel's vigil was finally brought fully into Caliph space for proper study and preservation, Elena stood once more in its familiar command room, now surrounded by curious scientists and engineers rather than empty silence. She looked at the chair where she had waited so long, at the memorial hall honoring crews lost to a war fought centuries before this new generation was born, and felt, for the first time, that her long vigil had finally found its meaning. 300 years, she said quietly to Farron, who stood beside her as always. 300 years of waiting, wondering if anyone would ever come, if anyone would ever listen, if any of it mattered at all. It mattered, Farron said firmly. It mattered more than you can perhaps understand. You saved my people from a fate we could not have imagined facing alone. Elena smiled, a genuine smile this time, free of the exhaustion and sorrow that had marked so much of their earlier conversations. Then perhaps the waiting was worth it after all, she said. Perhaps everything I sacrificed during that war, everything I lost of myself using the core, finally found its true purpose here, in this moment, with people I never expected to meet, in a part of the galaxy I never expected to see. Together, they walked out of the command room, leaving behind the quiet weight of history, stepping forward into a future neither the Caliph nor what remained of humanity could have predicted, but one that now, at least, held the possibility of hope, connection, and the promise that no one, regardless of species, need face the darkness of the unknown entirely alone. The Kestrel's vigil, once a solitary sentinel drifting silently near Mars, had finally completed its long-awaited purpose, and its captain, after 300 years of patient waiting, had finally found the future she had always hoped might come.